They set out on the edge of the Dakota Territory. The wind howled secrets that men were too scared to whisper. And in the middle of all that whispering wind was Elias Harper's ranch. It wasn't much, just a sturdy house, a few dozen cattle, and a barn painted a strange shade of blue, like a patch of sky that had fallen and gotten stuck to the earth. Folks knew Elias, but they didn't know him. He was the quiet man with the sad eyes, the widower who worked from sunup to sundown without a word to anyone. His wife, Anna, had been taken by the winter of '87, and she'd taken the light from the house with her. The porch swing never moved. The kitchen table was set for one. Elias moved like a ghost on his own land, his silence so heavy it felt like a second shadow. And that's how things were, quiet and broken, until the day the wagon came. The men at the saloon thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever done. Fueled by cheap whiskey and the kind of boredom that turns cruel, they'd pooled their money. They ordered Elias a mail-order bride. It wasn't a gift. It was a punchline. They'd thumbed through the catalog, their grimy fingers passing over the slender, smiling girls, until they found the one they were looking for. The oldest one, the heaviest one, a cruel joke gift wrapped in a traveling dress. Her name was Martha Lindale, 42 years old, the catalog said, and over 200 pounds. She had a face that was kind but tired, and hands that looked like they knew what work was. When she stepped off that wagon, the dust of the trail clinging to her worn boots, a hush fell over the town. But it wasn't a respectful hush. It was the quiet before the laughter. Snickers rippled through the onlookers. A couple of young ranch hands hollered, "Hey, Elias, did you order enough bride for two?" They were all looking at Elias, waiting for him to join the joke, waiting for him to send the woman packing, to laugh along with them, to confirm that a woman like Martha was nothing more than a spectacle. But Elias didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just stood there, his face like carved stone, and looked at Martha. He wasn't looking at her size. He was looking at her eyes. He saw a woman who had traveled 1,000 miles on the back of a cruel joke, a woman who was bracing for humiliation but was still standing tall. And what Elias did next, nobody saw coming. Not the smirking men from the saloon, not the whispering townspeople, and certainly not Martha. He walked right past the laughing crowd, straight up to her. He tipped his hat, a gesture of respect no one thought she'd ever receive. And in a voice clear enough for everyone to hear, he said just two words. "Welcome home." The laughter died in their throats. The joke wasn't funny anymore. In fact, it wasn't a joke at all, because they thought they were sending a broken man a burden. What they didn't know was that they had just delivered the one thing that could save him. But salvation in the Dakotas is a bloody, painful thing. And the men who started this joke weren't about to let it end with a happy ending. They had no idea what they truly unleashed. Martha spent her first night in the sewing room, Elias's late wife's room. It still smelled of cedar and dried lavender, a ghost of a life that wasn't hers. He hadn't asked her for anything, hadn't demanded an explanation. He just pointed to the room and said, "You can rest here." The bed was made, the floors swept clean. He'd prepared a space for her, for the joke, but his quiet respect felt dangerous. Kindness from a stranger was a currency she didn't trust. All her life, kindness had been the bait in a trap. It was the soft word before the insult, the helping hand before the shove. She lay awake for hours, listening to the house settle, listening for the other shoe to drop. She expected him to knock on the door, to make a demand, to finally reveal the punchline. The knock never came. The next morning she woke before the sun, a habit learned from a lifetime of trying to be useful before she could be noticed. She crept into the kitchen, expecting to find it cold and empty. Instead, a fire was already crackling in the stove. A pot of coffee was brewing, its rich scent filling the quiet air. Elias was outside by the blue barn, chopping wood with a steady rhythmic swing. Chop, stack, chop, stack. He moved like a man who found comfort in labor, a man who let his muscles do the talking his mouth wouldn't. She watched him from the kitchen window, a strange feeling blooming in her chest. It wasn't love, it was confusion. Why was he being so decent? The men in town had paid for her like she was a sack of flour. They saw her as livestock. Why did this man, the target of their prank, see a person? That day, he hitched the wagon to take her into town for supplies. He didn't have to. He could have left her at the ranch, hidden away. But he didn't. As they rode, he was silent, his eyes on the road. But when they reached the edge of Dry Hollow, he finally spoke. "Folks'll stare," he said, his voice low. "They got small lives. Nothing better to do." Martha just nodded, her hands clenched in the fabric of her skirt. She knew all about staring. She'd been a professional at enduring it for 42 years. At the general store, the whispers started instantly. Women hiding their smirks behind their hands. Men nudging each other. One of them, a wiry man with a mean-spirited grin named Jeremiah Crowley, the ringleader of the joke, spat on the ground as they passed. "Enjoying your purchase, Harper?" he sneered. Martha flinched, expecting Elias to ignore it, to just keep walking. That's what people did. They pretended not to hear. But Elias stopped. He didn't turn around fast. He moved with a slow, deliberate calm that was far more terrifying than rage. He turned his head just enough to fix Crowley with a gaze so cold it could have frozen fire. "She's not a purchase," Elias said, his voice flat and hard as iron. "And the next time you speak to her, you'll address her as Mrs. Harper." A collective gasp went through the store. Mrs. Harper. He hadn't asked her. He hadn't courted her. He had simply declared it, right in the face of the man who tried to humiliate them both. It was a shield, a wall he'd built around her with two words. But as they walked out of the store, the whispers turning to stunned silence behind them, Martha realized something chilling. It wasn't just a shield, it was a challenge. And Jeremiah Crowley looked like the kind of man who never, ever backed down from a challenge. Life on the ranch fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Martha cooked and cleaned and tended a small garden she'd started near the porch. Elias worked the land, repaired the fences, and cared for his cattle. They moved around each other in a careful, respectful orbit, the space between them filled with unspoken things. He never entered her room. He never laid a hand on her, but his presence was a constant, steady warmth. When she dropped a crate of preserves, shattering glass and sticky sweetness across the floor, he didn't yell. He just got a broom and said, "I've broken worse." When he saw her struggling to carry 2 heavy buckets of water from the well, he walked over the next day and simply dug the well a little deeper, making the rope easier to pull. He never mentioned her size. He never alluded to the joke. He treated her like she had always been there, like she belonged. This quiet acceptance was more unsettling than any insult. It made her question everything. She'd spent her life building walls to protect herself from a world that saw her as too much or not enough. But Elias wasn't trying to tear down her walls. He was just waiting. One evening, as she was mending one of his work shirts by the fire, she finally found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. "Why?" she whispered, not looking up from her needlework. "Why did you say that in the store? Why are you letting me stay?" He was cleaning a rifle on the other side of the hearth, his movements precise and economical. He didn't answer right away. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft scrape of the oilcloth against steel. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something she couldn't name. "My wife, Anna," he began. "She wasn't from here. When I brought her to Dry Hollow, they looked at her too, judged her. She was different. She liked to read books more than she liked to gossip. She painted. They thought she was strange." He paused, his hand still on the rifle. "They made her life hard, whispered about her, isolated her. I didn't. I didn't stand up for her enough. I told myself their words didn't matter, that our life here on the ranch was all that counted." He finally looked at Martha, and in his eyes she saw a chasm of guilt so deep it stole her breath. "I was wrong," he said. "Their words were like poison, slow acting. By the time I realized the damage they'd done, it was too late." Martha's hands froze. The story of a judged wife, a husband's regret. It was heartbreaking, but it also didn't quite add up. The way he said, "It was too late," it sounded like more than just sorrow. It sounded like a confession. The official story was that Anna had died of a fever during a blizzard. A tragedy, but a common one. But Elias's tone hinted at something darker, something hidden beneath the simple narrative, something the town didn't know. Before she could ask another question, he stood up abruptly, placing the reassembled rifle back on its rack above the mantelpiece. "I won't make that mistake again," he said, his back to her. "This is your home now, Martha. If anyone has a problem with that, they have a problem with me." And with that, he walked out onto the porch, leaving her alone with the fire, the mended shirt, and a terrifying new question. What really happened to Anna Harper? The threat of Jeremiah Crowley and his men lingered like a bad smell. They'd ride by the edge of the Harper property, their laughter carrying on the wind, a constant, ugly reminder. They weren't brave enough to confront Elias directly again. Not yet, but they found other ways. A fence post mysteriously broken. The gate to the cattle pen left open one night, causing Elias to spend an entire morning rounding up his herd. Small, cowardly acts of malice designed to unnerve them. Martha felt their eyes on her whenever she was outside, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She tried to ignore it, to focus on the small world she and Elias were building, but fear was a weed that grew fast in poisoned soil. One afternoon, Elias announced he had to ride to the next county to buy a new bull. He'd be gone for 2 days, maybe 3. "You'll be all right here?" he asked, his eyes searching her face. She nodded, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "I'll be fine. I've been alone before." But this was different. Being alone in the world was one thing. Being alone on a remote ranch, targeted by cruel men, was another. The first day he was gone, she kept herself busy. She baked bread, she churned butter, she scrubbed the floors until her knuckles were raw. She worked to keep the fear at bay, but as dusk began to bleed across the sky, the silence of the house became deafening. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside, sounded like a footstep. She was securing the latch on the front door when she saw it. A flicker of light up by the blue barn. A lantern. Elias had taken the only lantern with him. Her blood ran cold. She flattened herself against the wall, peering out the small kitchen window. 2 figures. She could just make out their shapes in the growing darkness. It was Crowley and one of his cronies. They were tampering with the barn door, trying to pry it open. Her heart hammered against her ribs. What could they possibly want in the barn? It was just old tools, hay, and empty stalls. It made no sense. Unless the barn wasn't as empty as she thought. Unless it held something Elias didn't want anyone to find. She had to do something. The sheriff was half a day's ride away. She was on her own. She looked around the kitchen, her eyes landing on the heavy cast-iron skillet hanging by the stove. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then she remembered the rifle above the mantel. Elias had shown her how to load it once. Just in case. Her hands shook as she took it down. It was heavier than she remembered. She loaded a single cartridge, the click echoing in the silent house. She didn't want to kill anyone. She just wanted them to leave. She crept to the back door, her mind racing. What was in that barn? And what would these men do to her if they found her alone? She slipped out into the night, the cold air a shock against her skin. She used the shadows of the woodpile and the water trough to move closer, the heavy rifle awkward in her hands. As she got nearer, she could hear their frustrated whispers. "It's locked up tighter than a drum," one of them hissed. "Harper must have something good in here." Crowley swore under his breath. "He does. I know he does. Find me a crowbar." Suddenly, a floorboard on the porch behind her groaned under her weight. A rookie mistake. Both men froze, their heads whipping around. "Who's there?" Crowley called out, his voice sharp. Martha's heart leaped into her throat. She was caught. She raised the rifle, the barrel trembling. "Get off this land," she said, her voice a reedy whisper she barely recognized. Crowley squinted into the darkness, and then a slow, cruel smile spread across his face as he recognized her. "Well, well, look what we have here. The missus is playing house." He took a step toward her, his posture full of arrogant confidence. "Put the gun down, fatty. You don't have the stomach to use it." He was right. She was terrified. But then she thought of Elias. She thought of his quiet kindness, of the way he'd called her Mrs. Harper, of the guilt in his eyes when he spoke of his first wife. That thought gave her a sliver of steel. "I won't ask again," she said, her voice a little stronger this time. Crowley laughed, a nasty grating sound. Or what? You'll shoot me? He took another step. He was only 20 feet away now. He was calling her bluff. Her finger was slick with sweat on the trigger. She didn't want to pull it. But then Crowley's eyes flickered past her, toward the house, and his smile widened. Maybe we don't need to get in the barn after all, he said, his voice dropping to a greasy purr. Maybe we'll just go inside and wait for your husband. I'm sure we can keep ourselves entertained. The threat hung in the air, vile and unmistakable. And in that moment, something inside Martha snapped. All the years of ridicule, of being treated as less than human, of swallowing her own rage, it all boiled over. She wasn't aiming for him. She was aiming for the lantern he'd left on the ground near the barn door. She closed her eyes, squeezed the trigger, and the world exploded in a blast of fire and noise. The rifle kicked back hard, slamming into her shoulder and sending a shockwave of pain through her arm. She stumbled backward, her ears ringing from the deafening roar. When she opened her eyes, she saw that her aim had been true, but the result was more chaotic than she could have ever imagined. The bullet had shattered the lantern, sending a spray of burning oil all over the dry wooden planks of the barn door. Flames erupted instantly, licking up the side of the building with terrifying speed. Crowley and his man yelled in surprise, jumping back from the sudden inferno. For a moment, they were just silhouettes against the growing blaze. The fire wasn't just a distraction. It was a monster she had just unleashed. Panic seized her. This was Elias's barn, his livelihood. She had just set fire to it. Crowley, recovering from the shock, turned his furious gaze on her. "You crazy woman!" he screamed. But his anger was now mixed with fear. The fire was spreading faster than either of them could have anticipated, the old dry wood of the barn acting as perfect kindling. The orange glow lit up the entire yard, painting the house and trees in a flickering, hellish light. The crackle of the flames was growing louder, hungrier. Crowley and his man exchanged a panicked look. Their little act of intimidation had just turned into a potential hanging offense. Arson was no small crime. Without another word, they turned and scrambled for their horses, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Martha alone with the monster she'd created. She stood frozen for a second, the heavy rifle hanging uselessly in her hands, watching the fire consume the iconic blue barn. The blue paint blistered and peeled away, revealing the charred wood beneath. Then her survival instinct kicked in. She had to try and stop it. She dropped the gun and ran for the water pump, her hands working the handle with frantic energy. She filled bucket after bucket, her lungs burning, and threw the pathetically small amounts of water at the base of the towering flames. It was useless, like trying to put out a forest fire with a teacup. The heat was immense, driving her back. Tears of smoke and frustration streamed down her face. She had saved herself from Crowley, but she had destroyed a part of Elias's life in the process. He would come home to find his barn in ashes, and it would be her fault. She was about to collapse from exhaustion and despair when she heard a thunder of hooves. It wasn't Crowley returning, it was Elias. He must have seen the glow in the sky from miles away. He rode into the yard at a full gallop, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. He leaped from his horse before it had even stopped moving and ran toward the barn. "Martha!" he yelled, his eyes wild. "Are you all right?" She could only nod, tears choking her. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip tight. "What happened?" he demanded. "It was Crowley," she sobbed, the words tumbling out. "They were trying to get into the barn. I tried to scare them. I shot the lantern." She pointed at the rifle lying on the ground. Elias's eyes followed her gesture, then looked back at the inferno that was once his barn. The roof was starting to groan, ready to collapse. Any sane person would have stayed back, let it burn. But Elias did something insane. His face went pale, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the loss of property. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." Before Martha could stop him, he let go of her and sprinted toward the burning building. "Elias, no!" she screamed. "It's not worth it." But he wasn't listening. He ripped a burning plank away from the doorway and plunged into the heart of the fire, disappearing into the smoke and flames. Martha stood there, screaming his name, paralyzed by horror. He hadn't run in to save tools or hay. He had run into that fire like he was trying to save a person. And that's when the horrifying truth slammed into her. There was something in that barn, something he valued more than his own life, something that Jeremiah Crowley knew about, and it was about to be consumed by the flames, taking Elias with it. The heat was a physical blow, a wall of scorching air that stole the breath from her lungs. For a heartbeat, Martha was frozen, watching the doorway where Elias had vanished. The roar of the fire was a living thing, a predator devouring his home. And then her paralysis broke. She couldn't let him die in there. Whatever secret the barn held, it wasn't worth his life. She grabbed a horse blanket from the fence line, dunked it in the water trough, and, holding the soaking, heavy wool over her head, she ran into the inferno after him. Inside was a hurricane of smoke, embers, and terror. The air was thick and black, making it impossible to see, impossible to breathe. Beams of wood, glowing red like angry serpents, crashed down around her. The sound was deafening, a symphony of destruction. "Elias!" she screamed, her voice swallowed by the chaos. She stumbled deeper into the barn, her eyes streaming, her lungs on fire. She could just make out his shape through the swirling smoke. He wasn't in the main part of the barn. He was in the back, near the empty stalls, frantically pulling at the floorboards. He'd ripped several of them up, revealing a dark, square hole beneath, a hidden cellar. "Help me!" he yelled, his voice raw with desperation. He reached down into the hole and was trying to pull something up. A heavy metal box. It was wedged tight. Martha rushed to his side, the heat pressing in on them, the roof groaning ominously above. "The roof is going to go!" she shrieked. "We have to leave." "Not without this," he grunted, his muscles straining. Together they heaved. The box scraped against the sides of the cellar and finally came free. It was an old military footlocker, heavy and bound with iron straps. Just as they dragged it clear, a massive flaming beam crashed down right where they had been standing, sending a shower of sparks into the air. They didn't have seconds to spare. "Go!" Elias yelled, pushing Martha toward the door. They half-dragged, half-carried the heavy box through the collapsing structure. They burst back out into the night air just as the main support beam gave way. With a sound like the world ending, the entire roof of the blue barn caved in on itself, sending a mushroom cloud of fire and smoke into the starry sky. They collapsed on the ground, coughing, gasping for the clean, cool air. They were alive. The barn was gone. Between them lay the scorched metal box, the cause of all this chaos. Martha stared at it, then at Elias. His face, illuminated by the dying flames of his barn, was a wreck of soot, sweat, and a kind of profound, heartbreaking grief. He wasn't looking at the ruins of his property. He was looking at the box. He reached out a trembling, burned hand and traced the lid. "It's all I have left of her," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Of the truth." He fumbled with the latch, his burned fingers clumsy. He finally got it open. Martha leaned closer, her heart pounding. What could be so important? Jewels? Money? Inside there was no treasure. There was just a collection of books, leather-bound journals, and on the top of the pile, a single exquisite painting of a wildflower, a prairie crocus. The painting was signed simply Anna. But it wasn't the journals or the painting that made Martha's blood run cold. It was what was tucked beneath them. A folded, yellowed newspaper clipping from a town in Montana, dated 5 years before Anna had supposedly died of a fever in the Dakotas. The headline was stark and brutal. "Local artist Anna Harper, presumed dead in stagecoach robbery. Notorious outlaw, the gentleman ghost, sole survivor." Below the headline was a rough sketch of the wanted man. His face was younger, he didn't have a beard, and he didn't have the deep lines of grief carved into his skin. But there was no mistaking the eyes. The sketch was of a younger Elias. And suddenly Martha understood. Her quiet, grieving rancher wasn't a rancher at all. He was a wanted man. And his wife hadn't died of a fever 2 years ago. She had died in a violent robbery years before he'd ever arrived in Dry Hollow. The woman he was mourning, the ghost that haunted this ranch, was a complete fabrication. He had lied about everything. The silence between them was heavier than the smoke still hanging in the air. The crackle of the dying fire was the only sound. Martha stared at the newspaper clipping, then at the man beside her. Elias Harper, the gentleman ghost. The names didn't fit. The man she knew was gentle, quiet, and kind. The man in the drawing was an outlaw, a killer. Elias wouldn't meet her gaze. He just stared at the contents of the box, at the journals of a dead woman he claimed was his wife. "Who was she?" Martha asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The woman who died here? The one buried up on the hill?" Elias finally looked up, and the raw agony in his eyes was staggering. "My sister," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Her name was Clara. After the robbery in Montana, I needed to disappear. I needed a new name, a new life. Clara came with me. She was all the family I had left. We told everyone she was my wife, Anna. It was safer that way." He picked up one of the journals. These were Anna's. My Anna, the woman from the stagecoach. She was an artist, a writer. She saw the world differently. She saw me differently. She didn't see an outlaw. She just saw a man. He swallowed hard. The grief, a physical thing. The robbery. It went wrong. It was my old gang. I was trying to get out, to leave that life behind with her. They wouldn't let me go. They ambushed us. I was the only one who walked away. So the story about the town judging his wife had been true in a way. He just substituted his sister for his dead love. He had been protecting Clara from judgment, trying to atone for not being able to protect Anna. It was a lie built on top of a truth, a house of cards built on a foundation of pain. "And Clara?" Martha asked gently. "How did she die? Was it really the fever?" Elias shook his head, a fresh wave of despair washing over his face. "No, it was Jeremiah Crowley." Martha felt a jolt, as if she'd been struck by lightning. Crowley. It was always Crowley. He was courting her," Elias explained, his voice venomous. "I didn't like it. I saw the darkness in him, the same kind of cruel streak I'd seen in the men I used to ride with. Clara was lonely, though. She wanted a life of her own. She didn't want to live in her brother's shadow, hiding behind a false name." He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "One night he was here. He'd been drinking. He wouldn't take no for an answer. He got aggressive. I came out of the barn and found him putting his hands on her. I saw red." The memory was vivid in his eyes. "I beat him. I beat him so badly I almost killed him. I broke his arm, his nose. I told him if he ever came near her, or this ranch again, I'd bury him where he stood." He took a ragged breath. He stayed away, but he didn't forget. A month later, during that big blizzard, Clara got sick, a lung infection. She needed a doctor. I tried to ride to town, but the snow was too deep. I was trapped here, helpless, watching her fade away. After the thaw, the doctor told me it was a bad strain of influenza. But he also said if she'd gotten medicine just a day or two sooner, she might have lived. He looked Martha straight in the eye, his own filled with a chilling certainty. The supply wagon that was supposed to bring medicine to Dry Hollow before the storm? It never arrived. It was held up on the road, robbed, by a man with a broken nose and an arm in a sling. Jeremiah Crowley made sure the medicine never got to town. He let my sister die to get back at me. Martha finally understood the full, terrifying scope of it. The mail-order bride joke wasn't just a random act of cruelty. It was personal. Crowley was tormenting Elias, twisting the knife of his grief. He was replacing the woman he'd killed with a woman he thought was a punchline, and his obsession with the barn. "What did he think was in there?" Martha asked. "He thinks I have the money from the stagecoach robbery," Elias said with a bitter laugh. "The papers said I got away with $50,000 in gold. But there was no gold. It was a payroll delivery, but my old gang took it all. I walked away with nothing but ghosts. Crowley has been sniffing around for years, thinking I have a treasure buried here. But the only thing I was hiding was the truth. The truth was out now, lying between them in a scorched metal box. Elias was a wanted man, and his sister had been murdered by the same man who was now hell-bent on destroying what little he had left. The game had changed. This was no longer about survival. It was about justice. The dawn broke over a landscape of devastation. The blue barn was a smoking skeleton, a black scar on the land. But for the first time since Martha had arrived, the emotional atmosphere in the small house was clear. The secrets were gone, replaced by a terrible, shared truth. They weren't a rancher and a mail-order bride anymore. They were two survivors bound together by a fire and a confession. Elias looked broken, but he also looked lighter. The burden of his secrets, of carrying so much grief and guilt alone, had been lifted. He had shared it with her, and she hadn't run. She was still there. "What do we do now?" Martha asked, her voice steady. She was no longer the timid woman who had stepped off the wagon. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a cold, hard anger. Anger for Clara. Anger for Elias. Anger for herself. Elias looked at the ruins of his barn, then at the box of Anna's journals. "For years I've been hiding," he said, "running from my past, trying to just be left alone. But Crowley won't let me. He took my sister. He's trying to take my home. The running stops here." A new kind of light was in his eyes, not the dull glint of sorrow, but the sharp gleam of purpose. The gentleman ghost was gone, but the man who had survived that life was still there, and he was done being passive. "We can't go to the sheriff," Martha reasoned. "If he finds out who you are—" "I know," Elias finished. "They'll hang me for crimes I didn't even commit. The rest of my old gang made sure I was blamed for everything. We're on our own." "No," Martha said, placing her hand on his arm. "You're not on your own. We're on our own." The "we" hung in the air, a declaration more powerful than any vow. It was in that moment that they stopped being two lonely people under one roof and became a team. "Crowley is arrogant," Elias said, his mind clearly working. The years of looking over his shoulder, of planning and surviving, kicking back in. "He thinks I'm just a broken-down widower. He thinks you're a joke. He underestimates us. We can use that." Their plan was desperate, dangerous, and relied on pure nerve. They couldn't prove Crowley had caused Clara's death. It was his word against a dead man's reputation. But they could prove he was an arsonist, and they could use his greed against him. "He still thinks the gold is on this property," Elias mused. "That's why he was so desperate to get in the barn. He thought the fire would force me out, and he could come back later and search the wreckage." "So we let him," Martha said, the pieces clicking into place in her own mind. "We make him think he's won." Later that day, Elias rode into town. He looked like a defeated man. He told the sheriff that a lantern had tipped over accidentally, that his barn was gone, his spirit broken. He made a big show of saying he was thinking of selling the ranch, that there was nothing left for him here but bad memories. He let the story spread, knowing it would get back to Crowley. He was baiting the trap. That night they didn't sleep. They prepared. Elias retrieved a second pistol from a loose floorboard in his bedroom, a relic from his past life. He handed it to Martha. "You know how to use it," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, her grip on the weapon firm. They moved the precious box of journals to the house for safekeeping. Then Elias took a small, sturdy lockbox and filled it with rocks. They buried it in the center of the barn's ashes, leaving just one corner of it sticking out of the soot, gleaming in the moonlight. It was a perfect decoy. They doused the area with water, not to put out the embers, but to create mud. Footprints would be undeniable proof. Then they waited. They sat in the darkened house side by side, listening to the night. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. And just after midnight, they heard it, the soft nicker of a horse and the crunch of boots on gravel. Jeremiah Crowley had come back to dig for his treasure. From the dark window of the bedroom, they watched him. Crowley moved like a vulture, picking his way through the charred remains of the barn. He carried a shovel and a lantern, casting long, dancing shadows. He wasn't alone. He had two of his men with him. They were talking in low, excited voices, their greed making them careless. The plan had been for Elias to confront them, with Martha as a hidden backup. But 3 men, all armed? The odds had just gotten worse. "Stay here," Elias whispered, his hand on the doorknob. "It's too dangerous." "No," Martha whispered back, her voice fierce. "You said we. I'm not hiding." She saw a flicker of protest in his eyes, but it was replaced by a look of deep respect. He nodded once. They would face this together. They slipped out the back door, using the same shadows Martha had used the night before. But this time, she wasn't alone, and she wasn't just scared. She was focused. They circled around to the edge of the ranch yard, positioning themselves behind the old stone well, which gave them a clear line of sight to the ruins. Crowley and his men had found the decoy box. With a triumphant yell, Crowley plunged his shovel into the ashes and pried it loose. They crowded around it like wolves over a kill, trying to break the lock. "This is it," Crowley cackled. $50,000, old man Harper's nest egg. Serves him right for what he did to me." One of his men looked up nervously. "You sure he ain't coming back?" "He's a broken man," Crowley spat, hammering at the box with a rock. "He's probably halfway to Texas by now. Besides, even if he did come back, what's he gonna do?" "He's gonna do this," Elias said, his voice ringing out in the night. He stepped out from behind the well, his pistol leveled, his body perfectly still. Martha was right behind him, her own gun pointed steady. The three men spun around, their faces a comical mixture of shock and terror. Crowley dropped the box of rocks, his jaw slack. "Harper, what? You were supposed to be gone." "You came onto my land," Elias said, his voice dangerously calm. "You threatened my wife, you burned my barn, and you murdered my sister." At the mention of Clara, Crowley's shock turned to pure rage. "You can't prove that," he snarled, his hand inching toward the pistol on his hip. "I can't," Elias agreed, "but the sheriff can prove you were trespassing tonight. He can match your boot prints in the mud. He can prove you were here when the fire started." Crowley sneered. "It's my word against yours, and you're nothing but a washed-up rancher." "He's not just a rancher," Martha said, her voice clear and strong, stepping forward into the moonlight. Crowley's eyes widened. He had barely registered her presence, dismissing her as he always had. But the woman standing there now was not the timid, soft creature he remembered. There was steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. It was this unexpected defiance from her, from the person he considered less than nothing, that finally made him snap. "You!" he screamed, his face contorting with fury. He forgot about Elias. He forgot about the treasure. All his hatred focused on the woman who had defied him, the woman who had dared to be happy in the place he sought to destroy. He drew his gun, not aiming for the outlaw Elias, but for Martha. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The glint of moonlight on Crowley's gun barrel, the snarl on his face, the defiant look in Martha's eyes. Elias shouted her name, but before Elias could even fire, a shot rang out. It wasn't from Elias's gun. It was from Martha's. She didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. The bullet struck Crowley in the arm, the one holding the gun. He cried out in pain and shock, his pistol clattering to the ground. His two men, who had been frozen in indecision, threw their hands in the air. They were hired muscle, not loyal soldiers. They wanted no part of a gunfight, especially one they were so clearly losing. It was over. The silence that fell was profound. Jeremiah Crowley was on his knees, clutching his bleeding arm, his face a mask of disbelief. He had been taken down, not by the legendary gentleman ghost, but by the mail-order bride everyone called a joke. The sheriff arrived just after sunrise, summoned by a neighbor who'd heard the gunshot. He found a strange scene. Jeremiah Crowley and his two men tied up, a box of rocks sitting in the middle of a burned-out barn, and a quiet, imposing man standing guard with a pistol, while a large, calm woman gave the prisoners water. The evidence was undeniable. The footprints in the mud, the trespassing, the clear motive of robbery. Crowley, in his pain and fury, sealed his own fate by screaming threats and accusations, admitting he'd been after Harper's gold. The sheriff, a wary but decent man, didn't need much more convincing. He didn't ask too many questions about the bullet in Crowley's arm. He just saw a woman defending her home. As they hauled Crowley and his men away, Crowley fixed Elias with a look of pure venom. "This isn't over, Harper. When I get out, I'm telling everyone who you are. They'll hang you." Elias just looked at him, his face unreadable. "You go ahead and tell them," he said quietly. After the wagon disappeared down the road, a tense silence fell over the ranch. The immediate danger was gone, but the larger one remained. Crowley would talk. It was only a matter of time before Elias's past caught up with him. "We have to leave," Elias said, turning to Martha. His voice was heavy. "They'll send a marshal for me. We can go north, start over again. A new name, a new place." He looked at her, his eyes full of a new kind of pain, the fear of losing her. "You don't have to come with me. After all this, I can't ask you to live a life on the run." Martha looked at the man standing before her. She saw the outlaw, the grieving brother, the lonely rancher. She saw all the broken pieces of his past, and she saw the man who had treated her with dignity when no one else would. The man who had run into a burning building for a box of memories. The man who had called her his wife to protect her. She walked over to the scorched metal box, which they'd brought back to the porch. She opened it and took out one of Anna's journals. She handed it to Elias. "She wrote about you," Martha said softly. "I read some of it while you were in town. She wasn't afraid of your past. She said you were a good man who had done bad things, but that the good was winning." She then looked him straight in the eye. "I'm not afraid either, but I'm tired of running. You've been running for years. I've been running my whole life, in my own way. Hiding, trying to be invisible." She took a deep breath. "I'm not running anymore. And neither are you. This is our home. We're not leaving it." Elias stared at her, stunned. "But they'll come for me." "Then let them come," she said, her voice filled with a strength that amazed them both. "Let them come and hear the truth. Not just your truth, but Clara's and mine." And so they made another plan. Not a plan to run, but a plan to stand. Elias spent the next 2 days writing. He wrote out his entire confession. He told the story of the gentleman ghost, of the robbery, of the men who betrayed him and left him to take the fall. He wrote about Anna and his love for her. He wrote about his sister Clara and his suspicion that Crowley had murdered her. He didn't spare himself. He admitted his crimes, his mistakes, his regrets. When he was done, he handed the thick stack of papers to Martha. The next morning, she rode into town alone. She walked into the sheriff's office, not as a victim, but as a citizen. She handed him the confession and said, "My husband, Elias Harper, is at his ranch. He is waiting for you." The trial of Elias Harper was the biggest thing to ever happen in Dry Hollow. The courtroom was packed every day. People came from 3 counties over to get a look at the infamous gentleman ghost. At first, the mood was against him. He was an outlaw, a liar. Jeremiah Crowley, his arm in a sling, sat in the gallery every day, a smug look on his face, enjoying the show. He'd been granted leniency on the arson charge in exchange for his testimony against Elias. He thought he had won. But then Martha took the stand. She wasn't an eloquent speaker. She didn't use fancy words. She just told her story. She told them about the cruel joke, about the men in the saloon who had bought and paid for her humiliation. She told them about Elias's quiet kindness, how he'd given her a home when she had none. She read passages from Anna's journals, painting a picture of a man trying desperately to escape his past for the woman he loved. Then she told them about Clara. She told them about Crowley's unwanted advances, about the beating Elias had given him to protect his sister. She told them about the blizzard, the missing medicine, and the robbery on the supply wagon. She looked right at the jury and said, "Jeremiah Crowley didn't just burn down our barn. He let a woman die because his pride was wounded. He is a coward and a murderer." The courtroom was in an uproar. Crowley jumped to his feet, screaming that she was a liar, but the sheriff forced him to sit down. The jury looked at Crowley, then at Martha, and then at Elias, who sat still and silent, his face etched with a quiet dignity. They were starting to see the truth. The story wasn't about an outlaw. It was about a man who had been hounded by his past, and a bully who had used that past to hide his own evil. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected place. The doctor who had treated Clara after she died took the stand. He testified that he had always been suspicious about the timing of the medicine wagon's delay, and then he produced his records. He had also treated Jeremiah Crowley for a badly broken nose and a fractured arm just a week before the blizzard. The timeline matched perfectly. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was a powerful nail in Crowley's coffin. When the verdict came, the courtroom held its breath. Elias was found guilty of his past crimes in Montana. The judge had no choice. But taking into account his confession, the years he had lived a quiet life, and the extreme provocation he had faced, the judge gave him the lightest sentence the law would allow, 5 years. And then, in a stunning turn, the judge ordered a full investigation into the death of Clara Harper, with Jeremiah Crowley as the sole suspect. Crowley was dragged from the courtroom, kicking and screaming, his mask of smugness finally shattered, replaced by the terrified face of a man who was finally getting what he deserved. Elias was led away in chains, but he walked with his head held high. As they took him past Martha, he stopped. He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled, a true, real smile that reached his eyes. 5 years, he whispered. Will you wait? Martha reached through the guards and placed her hand on his chest. I've been waiting my whole life for a man like you, she said. What's 5 years? She would not just wait. She would run the ranch. She would be its guardian. She had arrived as a joke, but she was now the keeper of a promise, the master of her own home. 5 years later, Martha stood on the porch of the ranch house. A new barn stood where the old one had burned, built with the help of townspeople who had come to respect the quiet, strong woman who ran the Harper place. The fields were green, the cattle were healthy, and the porch swing was no longer still. She was rocking gently in it when she saw a figure walking up the road. He was thinner, and his hair had more gray in it, but his walk was the same, steady, purposeful. It was Elias. He walked up the steps of the porch and just stood there for a moment, looking at her, his eyes full of love and gratitude and wonder. He had left a broken man, haunted by ghosts. He had returned a free man, coming home. Welcome home, Mrs. Harper, Martha said with a smile. Elias closed the distance between them, took her hand and said, It was always my home, because you were in it. They had been brought together by a cruel joke, tested by fire, and separated by the law, but they had held on. A man worn down by sorrow and a woman dismissed for being too much had found in each other not a second chance, but the first chance they'd ever really had to be truly seen and truly loved. Their story wasn't what people expected love to look like. It was better. It was real. If this story reminded you that everyone, no matter their past or their appearance, deserves a chance at happiness, then do us a favor and hit that like button. Let us know in the comments, what do you think was the bravest thing Martha did? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where the quietest people have the loudest hearts. Thanks for watching.